This is the story of how one of the greatest American tank victories of World War II has been buried under 75 years of mythology. You've probably seen the claim online. They sent 72 Tiger tanks to stop Patton. Fewer than 10 survived. The story is dramatic and compelling, but according to German Army records and armor historian Steven Zaloga, it's completely false. 0 Tiger tanks fought at the Battle of Arracourt in September 1944. Not 72, not 10. 0. What makes this story worth telling is that the truth outshines the myth. American tank crews in technically inferior M4 Shermans defeated 2 full German Panzer brigades equipped with some of the most advanced armor Germany possessed during 11 days of combat. Panthers could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters, while the Sherman needed to close within 400 meters to have any chance of penetrating Panther armor. And the Americans won anyway. 200 tanks and assault guns destroyed or disabled, while losing just 25 of their own. This is the Battle of Arracourt, the largest American tank engagement on the Western Front before the Battle of the Bulge, a battle that demonstrated something the technology-obsessed miss. Warfare is won by soldiers, not specifications. The strategic situation. September 1944. By mid-September 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had accomplished what seemed impossible just 3 months earlier. Since breaking out of Normandy in early August, his armored divisions had raced across France, liberating Paris, crossing the Seine, and pushing toward the German border at speeds that outran their own supply lines. Elements of Patton's Third Army crossed the Moselle River near Nancy in eastern France on September 11th, establishing bridgeheads on the east bank. American forces now sat within striking distance of the Saar region, Germany's second most important industrial area, after the Ruhr and the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive. Fortifications remained largely unmanned. Adolf Hitler looked at the map and saw disaster approaching. Patton breaking through to the Saar and reaching the Rhine River could end the war by Christmas, not the Allied propaganda version of that prediction, but the German version where Germany loses. Hitler ordered an immediate counteroffensive with one objective: destroy Patton's bridgehead over the Moselle, drive the Americans back across the river, and buy time to man the Siegfried Line. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army received the mission. The focal point of the German attack would be a small town in the Lorraine region that few people outside of France had ever heard of. Arracourt, the myth versus the reality. Before we go further, we need to address the Tiger tank myth directly because it distorts everything about this battle. The claim that 72 Tiger tanks fought at Arracourt appears repeatedly online, in forum discussions, and in poorly researched videos. Some versions claim all 72 were destroyed, others say fewer than 10 survived. The numbers vary, but the core claim remains the same. American forces faced and defeated a massive force of Germany's most fearsome heavy tank. Steven Zaloga, one of the world's leading armor historians, addressed this specific misconception in his 2016 book, Patton vs. the Panzers, The Battle of Arracourt, September 1944, which includes an entire appendix titled The Tiger Tank Myth. German Army records show that no heavy tank battalions, the Schwer Panzerabteilungen that operated Tiger tanks, were assigned to the Lorraine counteroffensive. The nearest Tiger-equipped unit, Schwer Panzerabteilung 506, was refitting at Ohrdruf in Germany during September 1944 and was later sent to the Netherlands to respond to Operation Market Garden, the Allied airborne operation at Arnhem. This unit was nowhere near Arracourt. American tankers recorded only 3 confirmed engagements with Tiger IV. Tanks from D-Day on June 6, 1944, to VE Day on May 8, 1945, in all of Western Europe. 3 engagements across 11 months of combat from Normandy to the heart of Germany. So what did the Germans actually send to stop Patton? 262 tanks and assault guns made up the German force at Arracourt. 107 Panther medium tanks, 75 Panzer IV medium tanks, and 80 assault guns including Jagdpanzers and WW2's. The newly formed 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, reinforced by remnants of the veteran but depleted 11th Panzer Division, organized this force. You might be thinking, if there were no Tigers, where did this myth come from? We'll address that later, but first you need to understand why the truth is more interesting than the fiction. The German forces, quantity without quality. The two Panzer brigades that Hitler threw at Patton represented a fascinating case study in how not to organize an armored force. Colonel Heinrich von Bronsart-Schellendorf commanded the 111th Panzer Brigade, while Colonel Erich von Seckendorf, who would be killed in action on September 21st, led the 113th Panzer Brigade. Each brigade started the campaign with 36 Panther tanks and 36 Panzer IV tanks. On paper, these were formidable weapons. The Panther, designated Panzerkampfwagen 5, was arguably the best medium tank of World War II with a 75mm L-70 gun capable of penetrating a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 meters. Its own frontal armor measured 80 millimeters thick at a 55-degree slope, making it nearly immune to the Sherman 75mm gun at combat ranges. And the Panther could reach speeds of 34 miles per hour with excellent optical equipment. The Panzer IV, though older, remained a capable tank by 1944 standards with a long-barreled 75mm gun and reasonable armor protection. 80 assault guns, Jagdpanzers and Sturmgeschütz, or WW2's, supported these tank brigades. These were turretless armored fighting vehicles built on tank chassis, mounting powerful guns in fixed casemates, cheaper and faster to produce than turreted tanks and serving primarily in defensive and ambush roles. The Germans had good equipment, but what they didn't have was good soldiers to crew it or good organization to employ it. Hitler's emergency measure in the summer of 1944, as German armored strength collapsed under the weight of Allied offensives on all fronts, the Panzer brigades were rushed into existence. These units received approximately 2 weeks of training before being thrown into combat, just 2 weeks, and veterans of the Eastern Front would later describe watching these formations with horror, knowing that German doctrine emphasized months of combined arms training to produce effective panzer units. The crews reportedly could not read maps. During the night of September 18th and 19th, the 111th Panzer Brigade got lost in the Perroy Forest during a night approach, March forcing the 113th Brigade to attack alone the following morning, a tactical disaster that cost the Germans dearly. The organizational problems went deeper than poor training. Unlike established panzer divisions, which were combined arms formations with integral reconnaissance, artillery, engineers, and logistical support, these brigades were just tanks and some infantry with no organic reconnaissance units, so they advanced blind into enemy territory, inadequate artillery support so they couldn't suppress American positions effectively, no engineer elements so they couldn't breach obstacles or conduct river crossings, insufficient armored recovery and maintenance capability, so damaged tanks couldn't be retrieved and repaired, and limited radio equipment so coordination between units was primitive. General Walter Kruger, commander of Ellwaldet Panzer Corps, described his troops as barrel scrapings. These were not the panzer crews who had conquered France in 1940 or driven to the Uppy Sea, gates of Moscow in 1941, but teenagers and older men pulled from training depots and factories, given minimal instruction on how to operate their vehicles, and told to stop George Patton. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for 5th Panzer Army, would later write about the challenge of coordinating an attack with units that had never worked together and commanders who didn't know each other. The Germans were assembling an orchestra that had never rehearsed together and asking them to perform Beethoven. The American Forces. The men who made the difference Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, one of the most effective American armored formations of World War II, faced this German counteroffensive. Major General John S. Tiger Jack Wood commanded the 4th Armored Division, nicknamed America's Rommel for his aggressive mobile warfare tactics. Wood had pushed his division harder and faster than any other armored formation in Patton's Third Army during the dash across France, and his philosophy was simple: bypass, penetrate, and keep moving. Colonel Bruce C. Clark led Combat Command A, one of the division's 2 main fighting elements, and Clark would later achieve fame defending the critical crossroads town of St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge. At Arracourt, he commanded approximately 4,000 men organized around 2 tank battalions, 1 armored infantry battalion, 1 armored field artillery battalion, and supporting elements. The key figure in the battle was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton W. Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, and if you've heard of an American tank called the M1 Abrams, this is the man it's named after. Creighton Abrams would eventually rise to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army, but in September 1944, he was a 30-year-old battalion commander leading Shermans into combat. General Patton himself later said of Abrams, "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams." Abrams's battalion lost 14 Sherman tanks at Arracourt while destroying 55 German tanks, and that ratio speaks to his tactical skill and aggressive leadership. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with 36 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, supported Combat Command A. The Hellcat was a fascinating vehicle, lightly armored but mounting a 76mm gun and capable of reaching 55 miles per hour on roads, making it the fastest-tracked armored fighting vehicle of World War II. Tank destroyer crews used their speed to execute hit-and-run attacks on German flanks, and the 704th would destroy 39 German tanks while losing only 4 Hellcats destroyed and 3 damaged. Now let's talk about what the Americans were actually driving. The M4 Sherman medium tank has a terrible reputation in popular culture. You've probably heard it called a Ronson because it supposedly lit up like the cigarette lighter, or a Tommy Cooker because it burned its crews alive, but these nicknames are largely post-war mythology. What's true is that the Sherman was technically inferior to German late-war tanks in direct combat. The Shermans at Arracourt were primarily armed with the 75mm M3 gun, which could penetrate the side armor of a Panther at 400 meters or the rear armor at 600 meters, but could not reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The longer 76mm gun that improved the Sherman's penetration capabilities didn't arrive in significant numbers until after Arracourt. The Sherman's armor was likewise inadequate against German guns with frontal armor thickness of approximately 2 inches at varying angles. The Panther's 75mm gun could punch through this at 2,000 meters, 5 times the range at which the Sherman could return fire effectively. On paper, this was a mismatch, and one veteran later described it as bringing a knife to a gunfight. Warfare isn't fought on paper, though, and the Americans at Arracourt understood something that specification sheets don't capture. Terrain, tactics, and training matter more than technology. The 99th Tactical Air Command, flying P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, supported the American ground forces, and when the weather cleared, these aircraft became absolutely devastating to German armor. Day 1, September 18th. The Germans attack. German forces launched their counteroffensive on the morning of September 18, 1944, with twin attacks from the southeast and northeast against American positions around Nancy and Lunéville. The 113th Panzer Brigade attacked at Lunéville, south of the main American bridgehead, meant to be a coordinating attack tying down American forces, while the main thrust developed farther north. What happened instead was a costly failure as American forces at Lunéville repulsed the German attack, inflicting 24 armored vehicle losses and 1,070 casualties on the attackers. The 111th Panzer Brigade was supposed to attack from the north simultaneously, but during the night approach march through the Paroi forest, the brigade got lost. Dawn broke on September 18th with the unit still trying to find its way through the woods instead of attacking American positions. This failure to coordinate the opening attacks was the first indication of the organizational chaos that would plague the German counteroffensive throughout the battle. Day 2, September 19th, the decisive engagement. September 19, 1944, was the decisive day of the Battle of Arracourt, and what happened that morning would effectively break the German counteroffensive before it properly began. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the 113th Panzer Brigade, having been roughly handled at Luneville the previous day, launched a new attack directly against Combat Command A's positions at Arracourt. Dense fog blanketed the rolling farmland. Typical. Weather for September in Lorraine, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters. The fog was about to equalize the combat. The Panthers' primary advantage was its ability to engage targets at long range with its superior gun and optics, and at 2,000 meters, a Panther could sit in a hull-down position and methodically destroy Shermans that couldn't effectively shoot back. In morning fog that reduced visibility to 300 meters, though, the Panthers' long-range advantage disappeared, and combat became what one American veteran later called a knife fight in a phone booth. Captain William Dwight led 4 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion into the developing engagement. The Hellcats executed classic hit-and-run tactics using their superior speed of 55 miles per hour versus the Panthers' 34, emerging from the fog to fire at a Panther's thinner side armor at close range, then disappearing back into the fog and repositioning before the Germans could return accurate fire. Captain Dwight's 4 Hellcats destroyed 9 German tanks that morning, and 3 Hellcats were lost in the engagement, but the damage to the German formation was severe. As the fog began to lift slightly, Captain Jimmy Leach led Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion in a counterattack against the German spearhead. Intelligence estimated they were facing 20 to 25 German tanks, and Company B charged into them. Sherman crews used fire and maneuver tactics that they drilled endlessly during training. A platoon would take a position in a hull-down position, turret visible and hull hidden behind terrain, and engage German tanks to fix them in place, while another platoon maneuvered to the flank, trying to get shots at the Panthers' weaker side armor. The key was never stopping. Sherman commanders knew that if they sat still and traded shots with Panthers at medium range, they would lose, so they kept moving, kept shooting, and kept forcing the Germans to react instead of dictating the engagement. Company B drove the German attack back, inflicting heavy casualties. By the end of September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 43 tanks, mostly Panthers, and 200 infantry, a catastrophic loss for a unit that had only started the campaign 2 days earlier with 72 tanks. The 111th Panzer Brigade finally arrived late in the day, having spent the previous night and most of the morning lost in the Paroi forest. But by the time they reached the battlefield, the momentum had shifted decisively to the Americans. Day 3, September 20th, Abrams earns his cross. September 20th saw continued fierce fighting as the Germans attempted to salvage their counteroffensive. Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Captain Richard Rice, was caught in an ambush near the village of Ley, when German Panthers that had infiltrated through the fog opened fire at close range, destroying 6 Shermans before Company C could disengage. Even in this tactical defeat, though, the Americans inflicted casualties with 7 German tanks destroyed. The critical engagement of the day occurred when German forces threatened to overrun Combat Command A's headquarters position, and 2 American tank companies found themselves outflanked by superior German forces, their formations disorganized and falling back. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, who was supposed to be coordinating the entire battalion's actions from headquarters, instead climbed into his command tank and personally led a counterattack into the German formation. His Distinguished Service Cross citation reads, "When two of his tank companies were outflanked and seriously disorganized by an armored attack of superior forces, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams unhesitatingly attacked the enemy force with his command tank, striking with such ferocity that the enemy was thrown into a state of confusion. This wasn't reckless heroics, but calculated aggression. Abrams understood that momentum in armored combat often matters more than firepower, and by attacking when the Germans expected the Americans to fall back, he disrupted the German attack and bought time for his companies to reorganize. The most remarkable engagement of September 20th occurred at Combat Command A's headquarters itself, though. German tanks penetrated close enough that the 191st Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 155 mm howitzers designed to fire at targets miles away, found themselves engaging German armor at direct fire range. At 200 yards, artillery crews designed to lob massive shells in high arcs at distant targets suddenly pointed their guns horizontally at tanks they could hit with a thrown rock. The 155 mm high explosive shells weren't designed for anti-tank work, but at 200 yards, it didn't matter because the concussive force alone could disable a tank and direct hits simply obliterated them. By the end of September 20th, both German Panzer brigades were shattered. They had started the campaign with 180 tanks combined and were now down to 54 operational tanks, having lost 70% of their armored strength in just 3 days. September 21st, the weather turns on September 21st. Something changed that would prove as decisive as any tactical maneuver. The weather cleared. Morning fog had concealed both sides' movements and negated the German advantage in long-range firepower since the beginning of the German counteroffensive. But on the 21st, for the first time, visibility was good from dawn onward. The 19th Tactical Air Command, which had been grounded by fog and overcast conditions, launched its P-47 Thunderbolts. A 2,000-horsepower radial engine powered the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter bomber that gave it excellent performance at low altitude, perfect for ground attack work. Each Thunderbolt could carry 500-pound bombs, rockets, and machine guns, but more importantly, American air-ground coordination had become highly refined by September 1944. Tank commanders on the ground could call for air support through liaison officers at headquarters, and P-47s would typically arrive within 3 minutes, just 3 minutes from request to bombs on target. The Germans had nothing comparable. As the German armor formations attempted to regroup and press their attacks on September 21st, P-47s appeared overhead and began systematic destruction of exposed German tanks with devastating results. Colonel Erich von Zeckendorf, commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade, was killed in action on September 21st. The Germans also attempted to reinforce their collapsing counteroffensive by committing remnants of the 11th Panzer Division, a veteran formation that had been severely depleted in earlier fighting in France. Throwing good money after bad didn't change the fundamental problems with the German operation, though: poor training, inadequate organization, American air supremacy, and American tactical skill that exploited every weakness in the German approach. September 22nd, the Battle of WW2's. On September 22nd, one engagement in particular would demonstrate just how thoroughly American crews had mastered the art of killing Panthers with Shermans. Captain William Spencer led 7 tanks from Company A of the 37th Tank Battalion into a meeting engagement with 22 German tanks near the village of Juivlies at a location called Les Trois Croix, the 3 Crosses, and the odds were 7 against 22, 3-1 favoring the Germans. Captain Spencer positioned his tanks to use terrain effectively with hills and depressions that would allow his Shermans to fire and then back down into cover before German guns could respond. His gunners had been trained to fire 2 to 3 shots rapidly, then displace before the enemy could get a fix on their position. The engagement lasted several hours, and when it ended, 17 German tanks lay destroyed or abandoned on the battlefield, while Company A lost 1 Sherman. After the Battle of WWII, the 111th Panzer Brigade, which had started the campaign on September 18th with 72 tanks, was reduced to 7 operational tanks and 80 men, just 7 tanks from an entire brigade. Something happened far from the battlefield on September 22nd that would prove strategically decisive. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower ordered Patton to go on the defensive. The reason had nothing to do with German success at Arracourt, because the Germans were clearly being destroyed, but Operation Market Garden, the airborne operation in the Netherlands, required every gallon of fuel that could be transported north. And Patton's Third Army, which had been racing toward the Saar and the Rhine, was suddenly cut off from the fuel supplies it needed to continue offensive operations. Patton was ordered to halt and defend his positions along the Moselle River. Strategically, this was probably a mistake, because the Siegfried Line remained largely unmanned, and a continued push by Third Army might have broken into Germany proper while the defenses were weak. Market Garden failed instead, and by the time Allied forces tried again to breach the Siegfried Line in October and November, the Germans had manned their fortifications. Tactically, though, for the Battle of Arracourt, Eisenhower's order didn't matter because the Germans had already lost. September 25th. So 29th, the final attacks. The Germans launched a series of final desperate attacks from September 25th through 29th, trying to salvage something from their counteroffensive, but these were piecemeal efforts by forces that had already been shattered. On September 29th, fog covered the battlefield once again in the early morning, allowing the Germans to make one last push, but at midday the fog lifted. P-47 Thunderbolts appeared overhead and proceeded to destroy the remaining concentrations of German armor. Pilots reported secondary explosions as ammunition and fuel cooked off in burning tanks, and the Thunderbolts flew multiple sorties throughout the afternoon, returning to base to rearm and refuel, then coming back to hit any German vehicles that dared move in daylight. By the evening of September 29th, the German counteroffensive was over, and the remaining German forces withdrew under cover of darkness. The final accounting was brutal. Of the 262 German tanks and assault guns that had started the campaign, 86 were destroyed outright, and 114 were damaged or had broken down and been abandoned, leaving only 62 still operational when the survivors withdrew. American losses: 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers destroyed, a kill ratio of approximately 4-1 in favor of the Americans, and that's being generous to the Germans by only counting total destroyed, not damaged vehicles. Why the Germans failed. The German defeat at Arracourt wasn't mysterious because multiple factors combined to doom the counteroffensive from the start. First, the fog. Morning fog in the Lorraine region during September was consistent and dense, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters and completely negating the Panthers' primary advantage, its ability to engage targets at long range. In the fog, combat ranges collapsed to 300 to 400 meters, where Sherman guns could actually hurt Panthers if crews aimed for side and rear armor. Second, the crews. The Panzer brigades had approximately 2 weeks of training, couldn't read maps, had no experience with combined arms coordination, and had never worked together as units. German Panzer doctrine, built over years of Eastern Front combat, emphasized careful coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance elements, but these brigades had none of that. Institutional knowledge. Third, the organization. The Panzer brigades lacked organic reconnaissance, so they advanced blind, lacked adequate artillery, so they couldn't suppress American positions, lacked engineers, so they couldn't breach obstacles, and lacked recovery and maintenance capability, so damaged tanks were simply abandoned. These weren't combined arms formations, but just tanks with some infantry, thrown together and told to attack. Fourth, piecemeal commitment. Rather than concentrating their armor for a decisive blow at a single point, standard German doctrine, the Panzer brigades attacked in disjointed thrusts across a wide frontage, and this allowed American forces to defeat German attacks in detail, one formation at a time. Fifth, predictability. The Germans repeated the same attack patterns multiple times, and American commanders learned to predict where the Germans would attack and prepared accordingly. By September 22nd, American artillery and tank positions were pre-positioned to catch German attacks in kill zones. Sixth, air supremacy. Once the weather cleared, American air power became utterly dominant, while the Luftwaffe was essentially absent from the battlefield, and German tank formations couldn't move in daylight without being subjected to devastating air attack. Leadership and morale sealed the failure. General Walter Kruger called his troops barrel scrapings, and he wasn't wrong, because these weren't the confident, aggressive panzer crews of 1940 or 1941, but tired men, inadequately trained, poorly equipped for the mission, and increasingly aware that Germany was losing the war. American tactics. How Shermans killed Panthers. The American victory at Arracourt demonstrates that tactical skill can overcome technical inferiority, but only if that skill is applied systematically. American tank commanders at Arracourt employed several key tactics. Fire and maneuver kept Sherman tanks from sitting still in an extended engagement. They would fire 2 to 3 shots from a hull-down position, then immediately back down and reposition before German guns could get an accurate range, and this constant movement made American tanks harder to hit and forced German gunners to continuously reacquire targets. Flanking attacks exploited poor German reconnaissance and coordination that often exposed their flanks. American commanders were ruthless in their exploitation, with Company A engaging German tanks frontally to fix them in place, while Company B maneuvered to hit the German flank, where Panther armor was much thinner. The 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate frontal armor could punch through side armor at 400 meters. Terrain exploitation gave Combat Command a control of key hills in the Arracourt area, designated by their height in meters as Hill 246, Hill 257, Hill 265, Hill 293, and Hill 318. These hills provided observation over the battlefield and reverse slope positions where tanks could hide their hulls while only exposing their turrets, and German attacks had to come across open ground under observation from these positions. Combined arms integration meant American tank operations were coordinated with infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, and air support. When German tanks broke through, artillery would fire on accompanying German infantry to separate the tanks from their support. Tank destroyers would use their speed to hit German flanks, and P-47s would attack any German formation that exposed itself in daylight. Speed and aggression defined M18 Hellcat tank destroyer operations. Capable of 55 miles per hour, they used their mobility to execute hit-and-run attacks, racing to a firing position, engaging German tanks at the flank or rear, destroying 1 or 2 targets, then racing away before German guns could respond. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 39 German tanks at Arracourt, while losing only 4 M18s destroyed and 3 damaged, nearly a 10-to-1 kill ratio achieved by using speed to offset armor protection. Training might have been the most important American advantage, though. American tank crews had drilled these tactics endlessly during training stateside and in Britain before the Normandy invasion, and they knew how to coordinate movement, call for artillery support, read terrain, and exploit German weaknesses. The Germans at Arracourt had 2 weeks of training, while the Americans had months or years. The Tiger tank myth. Where did it come from? So if there were no Tigers at Arracourt, where did the myth originate? Several factors contributed to creating and perpetuating the 72 Tigers legend. Wartime misidentification came first. Allied soldiers routinely called any large German tank a Tiger, even when it was actually a Panther, Panzer IV, or even a smaller tank seen at an angle, and the Tiger had achieved such a fearsome reputation that it became a catch-all term for German armor. This wasn't unique to Arracourt, but happened throughout the war. One famous example, Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, an artillery spotter pilot who famously mounted bazookas on his Piper Cub observation aircraft, was officially credited with destroying 2 Tiger Warrant heavy tanks from his airplane, but German records confirmed these were actually Panthers, not Tigers. Tiger sounded more impressive in after-action reports and newspaper articles, though. Numerical confusion likely played a role. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades started with 72 tanks each, a total of 144 tanks between them, and it's possible someone garbled the number 72 from the brigade strength and attached it to Tigers, rather than tanks total. Alternatively, the 75 Panzer IVs in the German force might have been misremembered as 72 Tigers. Conflation with later battles probably contributed. Tiger the second tanks, the King Tiger, even heavier and more powerful than the Tiger I, were present in significant numbers at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, and accounts from different battles became confused over the decades, with Tiger engagements from the Bulge being retroactively applied to Arracourt. Post-war mythology amplified everything. The Tiger tank achieved legendary status in post-war literature and popular culture as books and films emphasized German technical superiority and made much of the Tiger's fearsome combat power. This created an environment where any successful American tank battle was assumed to have involved Tigers, because how else could you make American victories seem impressive? Simple exaggeration finished the job. War stories grow in the telling, and "We faced Panthers" becomes "We faced Tigers," becomes "We faced 72 Tigers" over years of retelling. Nobody was deliberately lying, because memory is fallible, and dramatic stories are more memorable than accurate but less exciting accounts. Stephen Zaloga's research, drawing on German unit records and American after-action reports, definitively establishes that no Tiger tanks were present at Arracourt. American forces recorded only 3 confirmed engagements with Tiger I tanks from D-Day to VE Day in all of Western Europe. Just 3 engagements across 11 months of combat from Normandy to Bavaria. The Tiger was Germany's most famous tank, but also one of the rarest. Germany produced approximately 1,300 Tiger I tanks between 1942 and 1944, while the United States produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks for comparison. The Tigers were concentrated in independent heavy tank battalions that were carefully husbanded and committed only in critical situations, not scattered across the front to be destroyed in dozens at obscure French villages. The truth is, most American tankers never saw a Tiger in combat, facing Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns instead. Still formidable opponents, but not the mythological beasts that Tigers became. In post-war memory. The aftermath and legacy. The Battle of Arracourt effectively ended German offensive capability in the Lorraine region. The 2 Panzer brigades that Hitler had committed to stopping Patton ceased to exist as effective fighting formations, and the 111th Panzer Brigade, reduced to 7 tanks and 80 men, was withdrawn and never reconstituted. The 113th Panzer Brigade suffered similar losses. For the Germans, Arracourt was a disaster that achieved nothing. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "Although our attacks were very costly, it appeared at the time that they had achieved their purpose and had effectively checked the American Third Army." This assessment was wrong, though. The Americans went on the defensive on September 22nd, not because of German attacks, but because Eisenhower diverted fuel and supplies to support Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, and Patton was stopped by logistics, not by German. Armor? For the Americans, Arracourt validated several important lessons about armored warfare. Crew training and tactical skill could offset technical inferiority. Combined arms coordination of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power working together was more important than individual weapon superiority. And mobility and aggressive leadership could defeat static defensive tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on September 20th and continued to command armored formations throughout the remainder of the war, fighting in the Battle of the Bulge and the final drive into Germany. After the war, he rose through the ranks to become Commanding General of U.S. forces in Vietnam from 1968 to 1972, and then Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 1972 until his death in 1974, when the U.S. Army developed a new main battle tank in the 1980s to replace the M60. They named it the M1 Abrams, not after Creighton Abrams specifically, but after the entire Abrams family's military service across multiple generations. But it's hard to imagine that honor being bestowed if Creighton Abrams hadn't proven himself in places like Arracourt, where his tactical brilliance and personal courage defeated superior German equipment. The 4th Armored Division, of which Combat Command A was a part, went on to become one of the most celebrated American armored formations of World War II, later spearheading the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and becoming the first Allied unit to reach the Czech border in the final weeks of the war. The Battle of Arracourt appears in official U.S. Army histories, most notably Hugh M. Cole's The Lorraine Campaign, published in 1950 as part of the Army's official World War II history series. Cole served on Patton's staff during the war and had access to contemporary records and interviews with participants. For decades, though, Arracourt remained relatively obscure, outside of military history circles, lacking the dramatic name recognition of D-Day, the Bulge, or the Rhine crossings. It was just one battle among thousands, remembered mainly by the men who fought there and the families of those who didn't come home. Then the Internet happened, and with it, the spread of the Tiger tank myth, and suddenly Arracourt became famous, not for what actually happened, but for a fictional version that never occurred. The value of truth. The real Battle of Arracourt, American tank crews in Shermans defeating German Panthers through superior tactics, training, and coordination, is more impressive than the myth of destroying 72 Tigers. Why? It demonstrates something more important than firepower, that warfare is fundamentally about people, not machines. The Germans at Arracourt had better tanks on paper. The Panther was superior to the Sherman by virtually every technical measure of armor, firepower, and mobility, but the Germans lost because they sent poorly trained crews in poorly organized units executing poorly planned attacks against an enemy that knew how to exploit every German weakness. The Americans won because they had trained their crews thoroughly, organized their forces effectively, developed sound tactics based on realistic assessment of their equipment's capabilities, and executed those tactics with aggressive, intelligent leadership at every level from Army commander down to individual tank commander. Technology matters in warfare, but training, tactics, organization, and leadership matter more. This isn't just a lesson from 1944, but remains relevant every time military planners get obsessed with specifications and technology demonstrations while forgetting that someone has to crew these machines and employ them effectively in combat. The history of warfare is littered with armies that lost despite having superior equipment because they neglected the human factors that determined victory. The M4 Sherman, maligned in popular culture as a death trap, achieved a combat record at Arracourt that speaks for itself. 25 losses while destroying or disabling over 200 German armored vehicles, not the record of an inferior weapon, but the record of an adequate weapon wielded by superior soldiers. And that's what makes the Tiger tank myth so frustrating, because it obscures the actual achievement. When people say they destroyed 72 Tigers, they're implicitly giving credit to the idea that Americans only won by facing and defeating Germany's best equipment, and the implication is that without Tigers to kill, the victory somehow counts for less. The truth is more interesting, though. American crews in admittedly inferior tanks defeated German crews in admittedly superior tanks because the Americans were better trained, better organized, better led, and more tactically proficient. That's worth remembering. The Battle of Arracourt lasted 11 days in September 1944 in Tahoe, eastern France, with 0 Tiger tanks present, 2 German Panzer brigades destroyed, 25 American tanks lost, and a young lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams proving that aggressive leadership and tactical skill could overcome a 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage and significant technical inferiority. That's the real story. That's what actually happened, and that's more impressive than any myth.